Hi, Mr. Mullins.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Sorry for the back and forth.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to speaking with you today.
Great.
So just a quick intro on me. I'm Rithvik Raya. I'm a current eighth grader. I'm a voracious reader, and during my free
Great.
time, I play guitar, and I love traveling a lot.
Cool.
I read books on political science, and I want to be a neurosurgeon when I grows up. When I grow up,
Wow.
and yeah, that pretty much covers me.
That's
I
very cool.
research work for this interview and came to know that your book was Amazon's top political advocacy book, which is super cool.
Cool.
And
Where in school? What school are you in?
I go to Pineview. It's in Florida. It's like
Cool.
one of the top three schools in Florida. Yeah,
That's amazing. It's a public school?
it's a public school. Yeah,
In what part of Florida?
in Sarasota.
Great.
Yep.
Very cool.
So like, I was hoping that we could start off with like getting to know you as a person and your thought process and approach to the book.
Yeah. So I had been a reporter. So I'm from Washington, D.C. And I, for some reason, at a young age, like around your age, got really interested in politics and journalism.
Yep.
And so I went to school in order to try to be a journalist. And then I'd been a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for almost 20 years. And about maybe 7 years ago or so, I covered the lobbying industry and the lobbying industry is really how companies try to influence and shape laws and policy. So, lots of people think that members of Congress and the president, sit around and debate bills, but what they don't know about is the influence and the pressure that companies, and labor unions and billionaires, put on members of Congress to add things to the bills or take things away from bills. And so I sort of been covering that industry, and about 7 or 8 years ago, um, realized that I had written sort of enough stories about different lobbyists that it
Yep.
could be for a pretty good book. And because I, had a job and was married and have kids, like there wasn't really much extra time to try to write a book. And so I teamed up with my brother Luke, and we thought that together, working together, we could get it done and sort of divide and conquer, and that's what we did.
Oh, that's super cool. Yeah.
Cool.
So like, what authors or books influenced you the most as like a kid when you were writing?
So when I was around your age, I would read books. There's a guy named Theodore White, who has
Uh-huh.
to be like way dead by now, who wrote books about um, major presidential elections starting in 1960. So he wrote about John F. Kennedy's presidential election in 1960, and every book was called "The Making of the President 1960," "The Making of the President 1964." They're all just "The Making of the President." I think his last one was 1980, I believe.
Okay.
So for some reason, I just like loved reading those books and thought I was going to be a reporter covering presidential campaigns. Um, I really like books about presidents, the White House, and political campaigns.
Yes.
There's this other great book called "What It Takes" by a guy named Richard Ben Kramer, who's also dead. And that book was like 1,100 page book about the 1988 presidential election that I thought was amazing. So I kind of read books like that. I also read biographies of Truman and FDR and a bunch of books about JFK. And I just really liked, even though it's strange because I really liked reading those books, and they got me interested in Washington, even though in my career I actually never covered the White House and never covered a presidential campaign. So, but I think that sort of like drew me into Washington and and writing about Washington politics.
That's fascinating. I think I read like one of Mr. White's books. I think it was like
Okay.
something about China.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
So like, when did you first realize you wanted to be like a writer? Did you like go to college as a journalist or more like an English degree?
I think I was a little bit like you. So I found, my parents like would keep, various like keepsakes and stuff. And I found in some scrapbook that they kept, my mom taught personal computers
Uh,
to families when personal computers first came out in like the mid 1980s.
Okay.
And one of the first things that I wrote in on a personal computer that I printed out in, I think, like sixth grade, might have been fifth grade, might have been seventh grade, is I just said like I want to be a writer when I grow up.
Okay.
So I have proof back to sixth grade or so that I wanted to be a writer. I don't know why. I think, sort of like being a fireman would be cool, and I just sort of stuck with it. But then because I'm in Washington D.C. or grew up in Washington D.C., everyone in Washington D.C. or almost everyone is involved in politics in some sort of way. So one of my neighbors worked for Al Gore, and a different neighbor worked for Ronald Reagan, and a different neighbor worked for some other group. So you're kind of constantly talking to people in politics on all different sides, and
Hmm.
so I think that sort of just like kept me interested.
So
Um,
like your upbringing was like a big part of it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Like I think if I grew up in Kentucky, I might not have ended up being a political reporter.
Yeah, okay. So how did you approach the research for this book? Because I know you mentioned like that you kind of fused all of your stories around it. So did you do your own research or did you like
Yeah, so I sort of used a lot of the research that I had done in writing stories for the Wall Street Journal. I mean, the thing about writing a big story for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or Washington Post or, St. Petersburg Times or whatever is it, the more, or what is it, Tampa Bay Times, right? The,
Yep.
the
Yeah.
more, if you're writing 1,000 word story, it takes 10,000 words worth of research. Your notes are 10,000 words, and the best part is the 1,000 words.
Okay.
So much gets cut left on the cutting room floor that when I'd written front page stories about some of these characters, I had so much more information that just couldn't fit in one story. So I could see how I had a lot of extra material that I could use for a book if I wanted to. But then once even a book is not just taking a bunch of stories and writing them longer and stitching them all together. There has to be sort of other themes and more character development. So even though we started with a bunch of these characters that I worked on for the Wall Street Journal, there's a lot more reporting that needed to be done about um, the rise of corporate power and influence in the last 50 years and other players who were involved. And so there was a lot more work. I couldn't just take what I had at the Wall Street Journal and shove it into a book.
Okay.
But it gave me a great start.
Yeah. Okay. So like since you were like writing all of this, did you ever hit like writer's block? And if you did you have like a way to overcome it, like a nap or a cup of
Yeah,
coffee?
you know, um, one, I don't remember, and two, I kind of did this a different way. So I think when people conjure up the idea of what writing a book is you sort of like do all your research and then you take all your files and go to a cabin in the woods and just write 24 hours a day for months and months. That is not what we did. I mean, we were in a marathon, not a sprint. So our editor at our publisher, whose name is Simon and Schuster, she said, the number one key to a good book is taking your time, is not rushing anything. And because we weren't writing a book that was necessarily relevant to that period, as in, we're writing about a 50-year
Yeah.
period. So in a way, our book could come out 5 years ago or in 5 years and still be just as relevant. So the point is we didn't have any deadlines and we weren't rushing. Secondly, my brother and I are both married. We have kids. We have jobs. So the whole point of this is that my idea in writing is I try to write for 2 hours a day. So I try to write maybe an hour in the morning and then maybe an hour around lunchtime if my kids are taking a nap, or an hour at night. So because I already had a job and other family.
Yeah.
So I was just writing for 2 hours a day, and because I was just writing for 2 hours a day, I felt like I never got worn down, and I was writing like the first draft.
Yeah.
So I think to me, the first draft is the hardest. Once the words are on the paper, it's easier to go back and edit them and add to them and make things better, at least for me. So the hardest part was just getting them down. But because I was trying to write in 1 hour blocks, my idea was if I sit at my computer for an hour and I write 50 words, that's fine. If I write 500 words, that's better. If I write 1,000 words, that's great. But it didn't matter how many words I wrote because the next day I was going to do it again and again and again.
Okay.
So, if a book is our book, I think, was 160,000 words, which is probably twice as long as a book should be. But let's say a book is 100,000 words, and the minimum I think is 80,000 words. But let's say it's 100,000. Let's do some easy math. If in one uh in 2 hours, in 1 hour, if I could write 250 words, which is nothing, and the second hour I could write another 250 words, even if it's sloppy,
Yep.
250 words, you could take out your phone, walk down the street, and almost get to 250 words. So that's not that much. But if I could do that on Monday and then Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, and no breaks for weekends, in 7 days, that's 3,500 words. And that's pretty close to a chapter. If you do that for a month, that's was that 14,000 words. If you do it for 2 months, 28,000. All of a sudden, you're getting close to a book, and that's just by brick by brick by brick. So I never once sat down and wrote 3,000 words, or maybe I did 2,000 words. I doubt it. It was just hour plus hour plus hour plus hour plus hour. And then 6 months later, like, holy crap, I'm like really writing a lot of stuff. And my strategy was to take the rough chapters that I would write and give them to Luke. And then Luke would sort of go through them and make them better and change things around. So as a result of that, I don't remember having writer's block because I just knew I had to write for an hour,
Yeah.
and that wasn't that hard.
Well, that's great advice. Yeah.
Yeah, because anyone can write. I mean, my idea is like it doesn't matter how bad it is, just write. You can always fix it later. This is not perfect.
Yeah.
Like there's a different styles of writing, and I think my brother Luke is the opposite. Luke wants everything to be perfect, and so
Yeah.
I think he really struggles. Like it may take him 2 hours to write a sentence, first sentence. Because the first sentence is the most important, and I would just sort of like write something down and just to move on, knowing I could fix it later. And I think Luke would do the opposite. He'd really struggle on like how do you do this and turn things around. And my idea is like let's just write, let's just get. It doesn't matter how ugly and terrible it is. It just once it's on paper, you can fix it later.
Okay. Yeah. Wait, so like how long did it take you to write this book? Like from concept to like
So
publication?
from concept to publication, I think was about 6 years, maybe 7 years. Um, but in the beginning, concept is a loose term. So, that's like Luke and I saying, like, hey, what do you think about doing this? Then you need to get a book agent. Then you need to write a proposal. Then the proposal needs to go to a publisher. And the publisher needs to say, I'll do it. And then you need to get permission from your job to do it. So there's all sorts of things that went into those 7 years. I think the actual writing, um, I think the actual writing from beginning to end might have been a year and a half or 2 years. I don't remember. Let's see, when did the book come out? Let's say about 2 years. But again, that's 2 hours a day. There was never like with having three kids, I couldn't say, okay, wife, you take the kids for 8 hours. I'm going to go in the basement and write. That sort of would have been unfair. But what I can do is wake up early, write for an hour, wait till I take a nap, write for an hour, and just. I also didn't want to get burned. Maybe that's it. Maybe it goes back to your question about writer's block. I
Yeah.
didn't want to get writer's block. I didn't want to burn out. What I wanted was a marathon, just a little bit each day, a little bit each day, a little each day, a little each day. And also for me, I'm sure you feel the same way.
Yeah.
I felt when I started, like when you first write a book, you're like, or any like a paper, it's if it's 10 pages, like, it's so intimidating. How am I going to write 10 pages? That's so long.
Yeah.
But if you just write a sentence, if you write a sentence every day for a month, that's easy. That was my idea, is like just make it easy.
Well, that's certainly like a testament to your dedication. So like now can we talk about like the actual book, like The Wolves of K Street?
Yeah.
Okay. So like how did your book portray the evolution of lobbying from an ancillary practice to like a multi-billion dollar industry?
Yeah. So what we found out, and this was sort of like a big reveal for me, something I didn't know, was that before about the 1970s, companies didn't have much influence. So today, companies have tons of power, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Exxon, big banks, they have all this influence over, airlines, trains, they have all this power and influence over regular Americans like us. And what we found out is that in before the 1970s, companies didn't have much influence.
Yeah.
A lot of what we were sort of tracing was how did companies go from not having influence to having, like, what changed, why? So a lot of that history was sort of what was out there. So that's kind of what we were finding is why do companies decide to invest money in gaining influence in Washington, and what were their tactics and how their tactics changed more recently so they can stay influential.
That's fascinating. Okay. So, what role did the rise of like PACs and super PACs play in reshaping the power dynamics of lobbying?
Um, PACs and super PACs were huge. More PACs than super PACs, though. In 1974, we had the Watergate scandal, and Richard Nixon was, resigned under pressure. After he resigned, the American people elected 60 or 70 reformers to Washington, to Congress, who reformed Washington, made a bunch of new rules and regulations. And among the new rules they made is they legalized political action committees. At that point in 1974, the the political action committees that were out there were mainly run by labor unions.
Okay.
PACs were legalized. Companies said, "Oh wow, these are legal," and companies started starting them. I think we had these numbers in our book, but it there was something like a handful of super PACs, or sorry, a handful of PACs in 1974, and then like every year it grew by like exponentially. So there were like thousands of PACs by the end of the decade. And the reason that mattered is that members of Congress realized, oh, I can go around my district and try to raise money by like knocking on doors, or I can have a fundraiser and invite 300 PACs. And if each one of them brings $1,000, that's $300,000. That's a lot easier than making phone calls all day long to your neighbors.
Yeah.
But that gave industry lots of power because these members of Congress were raising um, roughly half of members of Congress got about half their money from PACs, which meant they were beholden to what companies wanted to do. It in order to keep getting that money, which was easy, they
Yeah.
had to at least listen to what companies wanted. They didn't have to vote for what they wanted, but they probably did most of the time. So the advent of PACs gave companies lots of influence. Importantly, not just with Republicans, but with Democrats as well, with both parties, which is why companies from the 1970s to now have gained so much power in Washington on both sides because both sides need their money.
Yeah.
Um, Super PACs is actually changing things in the other direction. Super PACs are mainly funded by billionaires, less so by companies. Um, and therefore, lawmakers now, I mean, lawmakers do whatever it takes to get reelected. And to get reelected, you need 51% of the voters, but you also need money. And now it's easier for members of Congress to get money from super PACs than it is from corporate PACs. And that's because, billionaires put so much money in these super PACs. So now it seems like the rise of super PACs is actually hurting corporations comparatively to like an Elon Musk. So the Elon Musks are gaining lots of power, and as a result, that companies are losing a little power right now.
Okay. That's fascinating. So, like, how did media strategies transform the lobbying efforts from 1960s to roughly the present day?
The main shift in media has been going from the big mainstream media to the internet and social media. So, before my time, there were in the 60s and 70s, there was, three network, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and their network, the nightly news is on at 7 p.m. every night, and everyone across the country, watch so they got their news. And then you get your newspaper the next morning, and that's the only news there was. And so candidates would try to advertise, on those those stations or in those newspapers, and or try to influence, get their names out in those publications.
Yep.
Now, as you know, with social media and the internet, there's thousands of publications, and you and I could start a newspaper today, or start a website today and write some column, and people might read it. So, and we could say whatever we wanted to say, including things that are not true or things that we think are true that other people don't think are true. So, that's really distorted how the country gets their information, I think, in a bad way.
Okay. So it's like kind of like Trump on Twitter.
Right. Right. So Trump is now saying, I don't need, because so many people are on Twitter or
Yep.
Truth Social or whatever he's on, he doesn't need to talk to the New York Times because he can talk to people directly. And
Yeah.
therefore he or Joe Biden or anyone else can say things that are not true. My opponent murdered someone. You can say that. And millions of people say, oh, that's terrible. I hate your opponent, even though it's totally made up. Whereas, for a mainstream reporter, you have rules that say you can't do that. I mean, I can get sued if I say that Joe Biden murdered someone. I can get sued. I could lose my job. My company could have to pay millions of dollars in a defamation case. So, um, one side, the traditional media has rules, and the social media side has no rules.
Okay. Well, that's also very interesting.
Yeah.
So, how did like Patton Boggs, under the leadership of Tommy Boggs, redefine the landscape for lobbying, and like what specific innovations or strategies set it apart from competitors?
So Tommy Boggs became a lobbyist in the 1960s, and to us, he represents. I mean, there were other lobbyists around the time that he was a lobbyist.
Mm-hmm.
Us, we picked characters who sort of represented different eras, and we picked Tommy Boggs as representing sort of the old school lobbying era that was based really on friendships. Back then, government power was only held by a few people. And Tommy Boggs, because he grew up in a household where both his mom and his dad were members of Congress, he knew all the important members of Congress. And so he was sort of this, he was this lobbyist who could just call up his best friends and get things done for the companies he represented. So his innovation was really using the relationships and using campaign dollars. He would use those corporate PAC donations that we just talked about to get to members of Congress. That type of lobbying has largely changed, but we write about him as sort of an era that used to exist.
Okay. So like kind of like a follow-up. If like what happened? Like why is it now that like everybody is like more using the company's influence? Is that like what led to the decline of patent box?
Um, I think it did, in a way, lead to the decline of Patton Boggs. I mean, because the firm was based so much on Tommy Boggs' influence and his relationships, and his star power,
Yeah.
that once he got older and he got sick and he had a knee injury and he couldn't walk around, he couldn't go up to Capitol Hill, he had to be driven everywhere, that he was just less effective at bringing in new clients and serving those clients. So that wasn't the only reason that led to the decline of Patton Boggs, but that was a big one.
Okay. So new character. How did Charlie Black's work with figures like Ronald Reagan shape the intersection of like lobbying and uh, electioneering? Is that a word?
Yeah. No, exactly right. So what Charlie Black represented for us was sort of the mixing of people who worked on campaigns and people who worked in lobbying. So
Yep.
Charlie Black worked on Ronald Reagan's campaign and other campaigns in 1980 and before. And when Reagan won, he decided to become a lobbyist, and he realized that lobbying was similar to running a campaign. That if in order to elect a member of Congress, you need to get 51% of that member of Congress's constituents to support them. And what he realized in a lobbying way is that if you could get 61% of a member of Congress's constituents to support a tax cut um, or a immigration or trade policy, then the member of Congress would follow also, because the member of Congress wants to do what their constituents want, so they get elected. So what Black started to realize is that you can lobby members of Congress the way Tommy Boggs did, and that can work. But if they don't vote with you, if they're not with you, you can go to their constituents and sort of run a campaign there, and then go back to the member of Congress, say, hey, member of Congress, 51% of your constituents want you to support this tax cut bill. And if you don't do it, 51% of your constituents are going to vote against you, and you're going to lose your job. And the member of Congress will always go with their constituents because they want to stay in office.
Okay. So like back to Tommy Boggs because I still find him a fascinating character. How did his like personality and connections influence his success and his like critique, like his critics?
Um, I mean, he had a big personality. He was a big swashbuckling cowboy. He came from sort of a different era where people are smoking cigars all day long and drinking scotch at lunch. So that made him lots of friends, and I think it probably made him lots of enemies also. But it made him. It's how he built so many important friendships on Capitol Hill that he could use to help his clients.
So, how did Lee Atwater's approach to blending political strategy with lobbying impact the industry's like more reputation than anything?
Yeah, I think that Charlie Black and Lee Atwater were sort of in the same mold. They're at the same firm, but
Mhm.
Charlie Black was more of an adult and more of a sort of traditional corporate America guy, whereas Lee Atwater played by no rules. He played by his own rules, and he didn't mind trying to use dirty tricks to screw over his opponents. And so, even though they're the same firm, I think some of the tactics that Atwater used created a difficult relationship for their firm, Black Manafort and Stone, which I think overall probably impacted the reputation of lobbyists overall.
And how did John Podesta's tenure under the Clinton administration, I believe, influence his lobbying strategies?
Yeah, so it's John Podesta and his brother Tony Podesta. So John Podesta worked for mainly in the government. He worked for uh, uh, he worked for Bill Clinton. He worked for Hillary Clinton. He worked for Barack Obama. His brother, Tony Podesta, was a lobbyist who sort of tried to cash in on those relationships that he um, would represent big clients and be able to go to the White House chief of staff, his brother, to try to gain influence for his companies.
Okay. So if like Tony Podesta was really cashing in on those, what led to his and Heather Podesta's like their firm's eventual collapse? Was it like
Yeah.
the revolution, like when Republicans took over Congress, or?
No, I think that he did a fairly good job of withstanding partisan changes in Congress. What led to their end was their divorce. Was
Okay.
that they were together and they made lots of money and they had lots of houses. They had his art collection, and when they got divorced, he had to pay her half of his what his net worth was,
Okay.
and therefore he was addicted or loved his art collection, and he didn't want to give it up. So in order to keep his art collection, which was worth tens of millions of dollars, he basically had to give her everything else that he had. And in doing so, he was didn't have much money in the bank. He didn't have any savings. He was really on thin ice. He sort of took a lot of money out of his firm to give to her, so he had very little cushion. And then when Hillary Clinton did not win the election, when Trump won, all of a sudden, if he had 100 clients, 50 of them got rid of him because he wasn't going to have the influence with Hillary Clinton that they were expecting. So all of a sudden, his firm started imploding. He didn't have any savings in the bank. So that's how his firm blew up so quickly. But it all kind of started with his divorce.
Okay. So like if it wasn't across party lines, so how did like Peter Kelly's work influence lobbying strategies across the party lines? Like were they influenced by Tony Podesta or was it like
I think that what these firms do, so taking Charlie Black for an example, and then Tony Podesta did the same thing, is you start off with a relationship to either Republicans or to Democrats. You've built loyalty by working for them. But once you've got your firm up and running and you're doing well and you're looking at sustaining your lobbying firm in the long run, as you know, the political control of Congress flips back and forth every few years. I mean, Republicans control the House and Senate right now. It's very likely that Democrats get the House in the next year's election. So if you want to be sustainable, you want to have Republicans and Democrats. So um, so therefore, in the 19 before the or right after the 1984 election, Black Manafort and Stone knew, at some point Reagan's not going to be president. Republicans are not going to control the House and Senate, so they needed some Democrats, and so they hired Peter Kelly and a couple other Democrats to kind of have a bipartisan look.
okay. So speaking about like a couple more strategies, how did like what strategies did Edward Kenny and Evan Morris employee that stood out within the industry?
You said Evan Morrison. Who? What was the other first name?
Ted Kenny.
Ted Kennedy.
Hmm.
So Ted Kennedy was a senator. He was not a lobbyist. Uh,
Okay.
but yeah, Evan. No, that's right. But Evan Morris um, was he was sort of the opposite of Tommy Boggs. He did have some relationships on Capitol Hill, but what he tried to do was sort of borrow the Charlie Black idea about trying to lobby the
Mm-hmm.
voters of members of Congress in order to get the members of Congress to follow. So he used the media and he used social media campaigns to try to get regular voters to support issues that were supported by his pharmaceutical company, his drug company, and then hope that members of Congress would follow what he wanted because their constituents did.
Okay. I believe he worked for Genentech, right?
And then
Like,
tech, yeah, right,
got acquired by Roche. Okay, yeah.
exactly.
So, how did the Clintons' political careers intersect with the rise of major lobbying firms? Like, I know Tony Podesta benefited a lot off that. Was there anyone else?
Yeah, so the Clintons, because they were around for so long, I think impacted all of our Democratic characters. So Tommy Boggs went to Georgetown, I think a few years before Bill Clinton, but um, when Bill Clinton was Arkansas governor and running for president, Tommy Boggs helped him raise money and helped him sort of make introductions around DC to help him. So they had a connection, and their connection, I think, was through Tommy Boggs' father,
Uh,
Hale Boggs, when he went on a campaign stop in I think in Texas actually, that Bill Clinton was his driver or something like that, way back in like 1960 or something like that. So they had this like deep family connection when
uh,
Bill Clinton was like 18 years old. But
uh-huh.
then Tony Podesta and John Podesta later worked for Bill Clinton. They all worked actually, an interesting story. They worked on a Senate campaign in Connecticut. I forget the year, maybe 1970, I think,
Okay.
when Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were at Yale for college.
Uh-huh.
Um, they worked for the campaign of some guy whose name I forget right now. And Tony and John Podesta also happened to work on the campaign. So all these like 20-year-olds came together to work on
Yeah.
this one campaign. And then later, when Bill Clinton ran for president, the Podestas came and helped him again. And then um, the Clintons then run into Evan Morris, or really Evan Morris runs into the Clintons. When Evan Morris was in college, he interned in the White House and was around a lot of Bill Clinton people and always adored Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton wanted to be a big fundraiser for him. So the Clintons kind of have touch points with almost all of our Democratic characters.
Okay. And what techniques did like Vin Weber use to navigate like the shifting landscape of
Yeah.
partisan politics?
I
Because like
think
he moved from like Democrats to Republicans, I think.
I think Ben Weber's always so. Ben Weber's used to be a Republican member of Congress
Mhm.
from Minnesota,
Yep.
and I think he was sort of more traditional pro-business Republican lobbyist. I mean, we only mentioned him in our book because he intersected with Tony Podesta and Paul Manafort in getting in trouble. But
Yeah.
um, I don't. There was nothing hugely notable about Vin Weber and what he did to sort of show a new tactic. He just sort of got caught up in this whole controversy.
Ah, okay. Well, I think that's all my questions.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mullins,
Yeah.
for sharing your time and insights with me today.
So this is for a paper, or what are you putting together?
It's kind of just like for an interview, like a type of list. It's a playlist, sort of like that I might show my teacher.
Great.
So
Awesome.
before we wrap up, if there is one thing you want readers to take away from your book, what would it be?
I think a takeaway is that Republicans around the country look at Washington and say everything's messed up and it's the Democrats' fault.
Uh-huh.
Democrats look at Washington and say everything's messed up and it's the Republicans' fault. And our point is that it's both sides' fault. This is things aren't messed up in DC because of Republicans. They're not messed up in DC because of Republicans or because of Democrats. It's that lobbyists and companies have influence no matter who wins. And so the companies always win because the amount of money they give and the relationships they make with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. That it's really more a fundamental problem with Washington than it is a problem with Republicans or with Democrats.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for
Awesome.
taking time to do this with me today. I
Yeah,
truly appreciate it. And
cool.
I hope you have a great rest of your week.
You too. Good luck. All
Bye.
right, thanks.
Yeah.